They say donating blood is an act of kindness, a simple medical decision, safe, forgettable. That night, I believed it too. I didn't know that in some worlds. Blood is never just blood. It is a promise, a claim, a line you cross without realizing there is no way back. When I lay on that hospital chair and let my blood flow into a dying stranger's veins, I thought I was saving a life. I didn't know I was marking my own. Years later, the most dangerous man in the Italian underworld would kneel beside my hospital bed, his voice shaking as he whispered words older than law and science. Blood calls to blood. By then, it was already too late. My name had become leverage, my body, a battlefield, my child, a legacy men were willing to kill for. This isn't a love story that began with fate. It began with a choice, and every choice after demanded a price written in blood. Natalie would later realize that what haunted her most was not the blood, nor the gunshot wounds, nor even the screaming sirens echoing through the emergency bay that night. It was one single moment, brief and razor sharp, that replayed itself in her mind with merciless clarity. The man opened his eyes at the exact second the needle pierced her skin. At the time, she had no words for why it unsettled her so deeply. Only later would she understand that some moments do not simply happen. They wait. The ER was chaos in its most familiar form. Another shooting. Another nameless body rushed through automatic doors under blinding white lights. Voices overlapped. Orders were shouted. Blood soaked through gauze faster than anyone liked. Natalie moved on instinct, not thought, slipping into the rhythm she had perfected over years of night shifts. She had always been good at disappearing inside emergencies, becoming efficient, invisible, necessary. The patient had arrived unconscious, his face pale beneath the dried streaks of blood, his vitals unstable, his identity unknown, no family, no paperwork, just a man bleeding out while the clock ticked loudly in everyone's head. When the blood bank called down to report critical shortages, a quiet tension settled over the trauma team. "Oh, negative, doctor," Patel muttered, scanning the room. "We're almost out." Natalie felt her hand rise before her mind caught up. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't selflessness. It was habit. She had lived her entire life responding before she allowed herself to question why. Universal donor. The one rare thing she carried in her body, inherited from a past she rarely thought about, and a family she had never truly known. "Doctor." Patel's gaze lingered on her longer than usual. He lowered his voice. "Natalie, you don't have to do this." Something in his tone should have stopped her. A quiet warning, gentle but deliberate. She noticed it and dismissed it just as quickly. "I'm fine," she said with a faint smile. "I always am." She followed the nurse into the donation room, the sounds of controlled chaos muffled by glass walls. The chair was cold against her back as she settled into it, rolling up her sleeve without hesitation. On the other side of the partition, she could see the man on the gurney, motionless beneath the tangle of wires and machines. He looked carved from stillness, as though even unconsciousness obeyed him. Natalie focused on her breathing as the nurse prepared the needle. A sharp sting, pressure, then warmth as her blood began its steady journey through clear tubing into the waiting bag. That was when the air changed. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like the moment before a storm breaks. Natalie turned her head without knowing why. The man's eyes were open, not fluttering, not unfocused. Open in full awareness, dark and piercing, fixed directly on her. Her breath caught painfully in her chest. He wasn't supposed to be awake. His injuries alone should have kept him unconscious for hours. And yet, there he was, gaze sharp and calculating, as if pain were merely an inconvenience. "Who are you?" he asked. His voice was rough, edged with strain, but unmistakably strong. Natalie's heart slammed against her ribs. "Sir," she said, forcing calm into her tone, slipping instinctively into nurse mode. "You've been through severe trauma. You need to rest." He didn't blink. His gaze drifted from her face to the tube connected to her arm, following it slowly, deliberately, until his eyes settled on the bag filling with dark red liquid. A faint smile touched his lips. "Oh, negative." He murmured, "Universal donor." A chill rippled through her, raising goosebumps along her skin. Patients sometimes knew their blood types. This was different. The way he said it felt less like recognition and more like discovery. "You're disoriented," Natalie said softly, though unease crept into her voice. "That's normal after blood loss." His eyes returned to hers, and something in their depth made her feel abruptly, acutely exposed. This was not the gaze of a man grateful for survival. It was the look of someone who had just found something he had not known he was searching for, as if she had been waiting for him. For a moment, The world narrowed to the sound of her own pulse and the quiet drip of blood leaving her body. She became painfully aware of the intimacy of the act, of how vulnerable it was to be connected to a stranger in this way, giving something so essential without conditions. Then the monitor screamed. The alarm shattered the moment like glass. Natalie twisted in her chair. "I need Dr. Patel in here, now," she called, adrenaline surging as she focused on the equipment, on the sudden spike and drop of numbers that demanded immediate attention. Footsteps thundered in. Orders were barked. The room flooded with movement. When Natalie turned back toward the gurney, her breath still uneven, the man's eyes were closed. His body lay still, chest rising shallowly, face once again slack with unconsciousness. He looked exactly as he had before, as though the last minute had never happened, as though she had imagined everything. She finished the donation on autopilot, her mind replaying the image of his gaze again and again. The needle was removed, a bandage pressed into place. Someone guided her to her feet. "You did good," the nurse said. Natalie nodded, but the words barely registered. The rest of her shift passed in a haze. She avoided Trauma Room 4 without meaning to, afraid of what she might or might not see if she looked again. When her shift finally ended and dawn began to bleed into the city skyline, she left the hospital with a bone-deep exhaustion she could not shake. She told herself it was over. Just another life brushed briefly against hers, before moving on. That was how the world worked. That was how it had always worked for Natalie. What she didn't know was that in a private wing of the hospital, guarded by men who did not wear uniforms, a name was being spoken in low, deliberate tones. Salvatore Russo. And somewhere deep within the man who now carried her blood in his veins, something ancient and irrevocable had settled into place. In his world, blood given freely was not charity. It was a vow. And vows, once made, could never be undone. If this story touched your heart, follow the channel to enjoy many more heart-stirring stories every week. Natalie woke with the uneasy sensation that something had followed her home from the hospital. It wasn't fear in the usual sense. There were no footsteps outside her door, no sounds that didn't belong. It was subtler than that, a quiet pressure behind her thoughts, as if a thread had been tied around her life while she slept. She tried to shake it off. Night shifts did that to people. Exhaustion blurred reality, turned brief moments into imagined significance. By the time she showered and dressed, she had almost convinced herself that the man in Trauma Room 4 had never opened his eyes at all. The knock came just after noon. A courier stood in the hallway, crisp uniform, impassive expression, holding a small black box tied with a silver ribbon. Natalie frowned. "I think you have the wrong apartment." He checked the label. Natalie Carter. There was no sender's name, no receipt, only her address written neatly, with a precision that felt intimate rather than professional. She accepted the box slowly, every instinct warning her that curiosity was not harmless. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, lay a pair of ruby earrings. The stones were deep red, cut to catch the light in a way that made them seem almost alive. Natalie inhaled sharply. She didn't need a jeweler to tell her these were worth more than several months of her salary. This wasn't a thank you. At the hospital later that evening, she mentioned the earrings to her supervisor, expecting mild concern. The woman's expression tightened instantly. "You need to turn those in," she said, "immediately. Gifts of that value violate policy." Natalie nodded. She meant to. She even placed the box in her locker before starting her shift. But throughout the night, her thoughts kept circling back to the weight of it in her hands, the certainty that whoever had sent it knew exactly what they were doing. By the time her shift ended, the box was back in her bag. At home, alone in her apartment. Natalie stood before the mirror longer than she meant to. The earrings gleamed softly when she held them up, their color echoing something dark and instinctive inside her. After a moment's hesitation, she put them on. The woman who looked back at her felt unfamiliar, sharper, more defined, not invisible. She took them off just as quickly, heart racing, and returned them to the box. The feeling lingered long after. The next day brought another quiet disturbance. The shooting victim, John Doe, had left the hospital against medical advice. No discharge papers, no goodbye, just a generous stack of cash left behind for the staff, and an unspoken understanding that questions would not be answered. "Doctor?" Patel found her during a brief lull, his voice careful. "You didn't hear this from me," he said, "but someone was asking about you." Natalie's stomach tightened. "Who?" He hesitated. "I didn't ask." That night, when Natalie returned home, she knew instantly that something was wrong. The apartment was too orderly. The air carried a faint scent she didn't recognize, warm, expensive, unmistakably male. Nothing was missing. Instead, everything had been added to. Her refrigerator, usually half empty, was stocked with neatly prepared meals in glass containers. Fresh flowers stood on the kitchen table, dark red roses arranged with deliberate care. A folded note lay beside them. Her hands trembled as she opened it. "Forgive the intrusion. Dine with me tomorrow evening. 8 o'clock. The key opens the private elevator. No name. None was necessary." Natalie didn't sleep. Anger warred with unease, fascination tangling with the instinct to run. Someone had entered her home without force, without theft, without apology and expected gratitude. It was a violation wrapped in courtesy, and that made it worse. By morning, she had decided she would go, not because she was tempted, she told herself, but because she refused to be frightened into silence. She dressed simply, deliberately avoiding anything that might look like an attempt to impress. When she reached the building indicated by the address on the key, her pulse quickened despite her resolve. The elevator accepted the key with a soft chime, doors closing behind her with a finality that made her breath hitch. As it ascended, the city seemed to fall away beneath her, replaced by a charged stillness. The doors opened onto a vast, elegant space overlooking Manhattan's lights. Salvatore Russo stood near the window, his posture relaxed, his presence commanding without effort. He turned as she entered, dark eyes settling on her with unmistakable recognition. "Natalie," he said, as though the sound of her name belonged to him. "Thank you for coming." "You had no right to enter my home," she said. Skipping pleasantries. "No," he agreed calmly, "but I ensured your comfort. That doesn't make it acceptable." A faint smile touched his lips. "In my world, comfort is never offered without reason." They sat across from one another at a table laid with exquisite care. Salvatore spoke easily, asking about her work, listening with an attention that felt unsettlingly sincere. He offered nothing of himself beyond vague references to business and travel, but his gaze never left her for long. "I don't accept debts," Natalie said finally. "If this is your way of repaying me, it is not," he interrupted gently. "There are debts that cannot be repaid." Before she could respond, his phone vibrated. He glanced at the screen, and the warmth in his expression vanished. He replied in rapid Italian, voice low and clipped. "I'm afraid our evening must end early," he said, standing. "Antonio will take you home." "What happened?" Natalie asked. Salvatore stepped closer, lowering his voice. "The world noticed you," he said, "and the world is not kind to what it notices." As she left, his hand brushed hers briefly, deliberate and grounding. "Until next time," he murmured. "My blood angel." The words followed her into the night, settling deep beneath her skin. Natalie didn't yet understand what it meant to be named, only that something irreversible had begun. And far below the penthouse, in corners of the city that thrived on whispered power, her existence had already started to matter in ways she could no longer control. For days after that night, Natalie tried to convince herself that the tension would fade. She returned to her routines with stubborn discipline, clinging to the familiar rhythm of hospital corridors and night shifts, telling herself that the unease pressing against her thoughts was nothing more than exhaustion. But the city no longer felt neutral. It watched her, reflected her back at herself in darkened windows and polished glass, as if reminding her that she had been noticed. Salvatore Russo did not contact her. The silence should have been a relief. Instead, it felt deliberate, like the pause between breaths before something irreversible. Natalie caught herself checking her phone without meaning to, then resenting herself for it. She told herself that curiosity was not the same as desire, that vigilance was not attachment. Still, the memory of his voice, the way he had spoken her name as if it carried weight, lingered in her thoughts with uncomfortable persistence. On her fourth night shift after the dinner, "Doctor?" Patel studied her more closely than usual. "You're distracted," he said gently. "Everything all right?" Natalie forced a smile, just tired. He nodded, but the concern in his eyes remained. Hospitals thrived on rumor, and some names carried gravity even when no one spoke them aloud. Natalie wondered how much he suspected, how much he chose not to know. The answer came later that night. She was halfway home when the feeling returned sharp, unmistakable, being followed. Natalie slowed her steps, heart hammering, scanning reflections in parked cars and shop windows. A man stood across the street, posture casual, gaze sliding away when she looked directly at him. He didn't move closer. He didn't leave. He simply waited. Natalie turned the corner and didn't look back. When she reached her apartment, her hands shook as she unlocked the door. The lights flicked on automatically, bathing the space in familiar warmth. Nothing appeared out of place. And yet, the sense of intrusion lingered, coiling tight in her chest. Her phone vibrated. Do not be afraid. The message read, "You are being watched because you matter." Natalie's pulse spiked. "This isn't protection," she typed back. "It's intimidation." The reply came almost immediately. "In my world, the line is thin." She stared at the screen, anger flaring. "You don't get to decide that for me." There was a pause this time, long enough for her breath to steady. "Then, come to me, tonight." Natalie hesitated, every instinct at war. She could refuse. She should refuse. And yet, the alternative remaining alone with unanswered questions and unseen eyes felt worse. She reached for the key before she could overthink it. The penthouse greeted her with quiet restraint. No flowers this time, no table set for dinner. The city glowed beyond the windows, distant and indifferent. Salvatore stood near the glass, jacket discarded, sleeves rolled up, his expression unreadable as he turned toward her. "You were followed," he said, not asking. Natalie's composure cracked. "You knew," she said. "You let it happen." "I allowed it," he corrected. "So I could be certain." "Of what?" "Of who?" The simplicity of his answer unsettled her. "You're treating my life like a test." Salvatore met her anger without flinching. "I am treating it like something valuable," he said. "There are men who saw you at the gala, men who understand what blood freely given implies." She shook her head sharply. "I don't believe in that." "You don't have to," he replied. "They do." He moved closer, stopping a careful distance away. "Once someone like me survives because of your blood, you become visible," he said quietly. "Not owned, but claimed. As someone worth leverage." The word sent a chill through her. "So this is about control." "No," Salvatore said. "It's about consequence." Natalie folded her arms, grounding herself. "Then tell me the truth." She said, "All of it." For a long moment, he studied her, weighing something unseen. Finally, he spoke not with theatrics, but with deliberate restraint. He told her about Sicily, about old traditions woven into the fabric of his world, about blood not as superstition, but as symbol, as proof of choice. He spoke of debts that could not be measured in currency, of protection that was expected, not requested. "You marked me," he said simply. "And in doing so, you marked yourself." The words landed heavily. Natalie laughed softly, disbelief edging her voice. "You make it sound like fate." Salvatore's gaze sharpened. "I don't believe in fate," he said. "I believe in responsibility." Before she could respond, his phone vibrated. The shift in him was immediate, the air around him tightening. He read the message, jaw hardening, then looked back at her. "You should stay here tonight," he said. "Not because I demand it, because I cannot guarantee your safety elsewhere." Natalie hesitated, pride bristling. "And tomorrow, he said. "You decide." The offer surprised her more than any threat could have. He was not forcing her. He was placing the weight of the choice in her hands. She exhaled slowly and nodded once. Later, as night deepened and the city quieted, Natalie stood alone by the window, the enormity of what she had stepped into settling over her. Salvatore joined her without speaking, his presence steady at her side. They did not touch. They did not need to. Below them, the city moved on, unaware of the shift unfolding above it. Natalie understood then that she could still walk away, still reclaim the life she had known. But she also understood that invisibility, once lost, could never truly be regained. And somewhere in the shadows, others were already adjusting their calculations, drawn by the quiet knowledge that Salvatore Russo had found something he was unwilling to surrender. Natalie woke before dawn, the city still wrapped in a fragile quiet that felt borrowed rather than earned. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The ceiling above her was too high, the air too still. Then memory returned in fragments: the penthouse, the glass walls, the knowledge that someone had decided her safety required relocation without asking her permission. She sat up slowly, grounding herself. She was not afraid. That, more than anything, unsettled her. Salvatore was already awake. He stood near the windows, speaking in low Italian into his phone, his posture rigid, shoulders squared as if bracing for impact. When he ended the call and turned toward her, something unreadable passed across his face. "You didn't sleep," she observed. "Enough," he replied. "Did you?" Natalie considered lying, then chose not to. No. They moved around each other with careful distance as the morning unfolded, neither quite sure how to inhabit the same space without turning it into a negotiation. Salvatore kept his word. He did not command. He did not hover. He offered coffee, asked if she needed clothes, then left her alone with the city and her thoughts. By mid-morning, Natalie felt the familiar itch of restlessness. "I'm going to work," she said, pulling on her jacket. Salvatore's jaw tightened. "Not today. That wasn't a request," she replied calmly. He studied her for a long moment. "Someone tested the perimeter last night," he said. "A probe, not an attack." "And your solution is to lock me in a tower," she said. "My solution," he said quietly, "is to keep you breathing." Natalie stepped closer, meeting his gaze without flinching. "You don't get to turn my life into a precaution," she said. "If you want me here, it's because I choose to be here." Silence stretched between them, thick with restraint. Finally, Salvatore nodded once. "Then choose," he said. "But understand the cost." She left anyway. The walk to the hospital felt different. Every sound registered sharper. Every movement carried meaning. Natalie was halfway down the block when it happened. A sudden hand closing around her arm, pulling her back hard enough to steal her breath. She reacted on instinct. Elbow back, heel down. She twisted free and stumbled, heart pounding. The man didn't pursue her. He stood a few feet away, eyes cold and assessing. "You're harder to reach than expected," he said lightly. Natalie's pulse roared in her ears. "Who are you? Someone who appreciates rare things," he replied, "and rare blood." Before she could respond, a car screeched to a halt. Salvatore was there in seconds, fury contained behind a mask of lethal calm. The stranger retreated without protest, melting into the city as if he had never been there. Salvatore turned to Natalie, his control cracking. "I told you not to leave. And now you know why I had to," she shot back, adrenaline still flooding her system. "This isn't hypothetical anymore." They returned to the penthouse in silence, tension coiling tighter with every floor the elevator climbed. Once inside, Natalie rounded on him. "That man wasn't afraid of you," she said. "He was measuring me." Salvatore didn't deny it. "His name is Martinelli," he said, "and he enjoys proving points." "What point?" she demanded. "That you are leverage." The word landed like a blow. Natalie folded her arms, forcing her breath steady. "Then stop treating me like one," she said. "If I'm in this, I need the truth. All of it." Salvatore hesitated, then nodded. "Come," he said. He led her to a room she hadn't seen before, hidden behind a seamless panel. Inside, the air smelled faintly of antiseptic. A medical table stood at the center, supplies neatly organized nearby. Natalie's stomach dropped. "You planned for this," she said. "I planned for survival," he replied. She didn't answer. She couldn't. The implications pressed down on her, heavy and unavoidable. She turned to leave, but pain lanced suddenly through Salvatore's side. He staggered, hand going to his ribs, blood blooming dark against his shirt. Natalie was at his side instantly. "Sit," she ordered, voice sharp with professional command. The wound was fresh, a graze from a bullet she hadn't known had been fired. She worked quickly, efficiently, cutting fabric, cleaning blood, her hands steady even as anger burned beneath her calm. "You were hit, and you didn't tell me," she said. "I didn't want to alarm you," he replied through clenched teeth. She shot him a look. "You don't get to decide what alarms me." As she secured the bandage, Salvatore watched her with an intensity that felt different now, less possessive, more reverent. "You didn't hesitate," he said. "I don't when someone is bleeding." She replied, "Especially when it's because of me." "That's not true," he said quietly. "It's because of me." The admission shifted something between them. Natalie stepped back, wiping her hands. "This can't continue like this," she said. "You taking bullets and pretending it's fine. Me being moved around like cargo." Salvatore straightened slowly. "Then what do you propose?" She met his gaze, resolve settling in. "If I stay, it's on my terms," she said. "No secrets, no half-truths, no deciding my safety without me. And if I can't guarantee that he asked, then I leave," she said simply. The words hung in the air, undeniable and final. Salvatore looked at her for a long time, weighing power against consequence, instinct against respect. At last, he reached into his pocket and placed something cool and heavy into her palm. "A key. This opens every door in this building," he said, "including the ones I've kept closed." Natalie closed her fingers around it, feeling the weight of what it represented. Access, choice, risk. She didn't smile. She didn't thank him. She simply nodded once. Outside, the city pulsed on, unaware that a line had been crossed not with violence, but with consent. And Natalie understood, with quiet certainty, that the key she held was not to a place, but to a life that would never again be simple. The invitation arrived without ceremony, as if it were an inevitability rather than a request. A single card, thick and ivory, placed on the kitchen counter sometime during the night. Natalie knew it had appeared before she touched it. She had learned to feel disturbances in space now, the quiet rearranging of her life by hands that did not ask. A gathering, Salvatore said when she confronted him, his tone neutral. Allies. Observers. A test, she replied. He did not disagree. Natalie stood by the window as dusk settled over the city, watching the lights ignite one by one. She understood the subtext without needing it explained. Her presence would be noted, catalogued, interpreted. In Salvatore's world, appearances were declarations. And tonight, whether she wanted it or not, she would be seen. She dressed with deliberate restraint, no excess, no softness meant to invite protection. When she stepped out beside Salvatore, his hand hovered briefly at her back, not possessive, but steady, as if anchoring both of them against what waited beyond the doors. The mansion overlooked the river, restored to opulence that felt less like beauty and more like warning. Security moved with seamless coordination, eyes sharp, movements economical. Conversations inside ebbed and flowed with practiced ease, laughter too smooth to be genuine. Natalie felt the shift as they entered, the subtle recalibration of attention. She had become the variable no one had accounted for. Salvatore did not introduce her. He didn't need to. Her presence beside him was introduction enough. They moved through the room together, accepting greetings, exchanging measured pleasantries. Natalie felt the weight of gazes sliding over her, dissecting. She met them calmly, refusing to shrink, refusing to perform. This was not a costume she could wear. It was a threshold she had crossed. The man emerged from the crowd as if summoned by her resolve. Tall, impeccably dressed. His smile was polished, but his eyes were cold. "So," he said lightly, addressing Salvatore without looking away from Natalie. "This is the complication." Salvatore's posture shifted imperceptibly. "Martinelli," he said. "You're mistaken." "Am I?" Martinelli's gaze flicked over Natalie with open curiosity. "She doesn't look like a distraction. She looks consequential?" Natalie felt the words land like a challenge. "I'm standing right here," she said evenly. Martinelli's smile widened. "Good," he replied. "I prefer clarity." He leaned closer, lowering his voice. "You should know," he said to her. "Men like Salvatore do not collect anything they cannot control." Before Natalie could respond, Salvatore stepped between them, his voice quiet and lethal. "Step away." The room stilled. Conversations faltered, attention sharpening. Martinelli raised his hands in mock surrender, amusement flickering across his features. "Careful," he said softly. "You're making your priorities very visible." Salvatore did not blink. That was the intention. Martinelli laughed lightly and drifted away. But the damage was done. Natalie felt it like a ripple through water. She was no longer anonymous. She was a point of leverage. The rest of the evening passed in fragments. Natalie answered questions that were not truly questions. She smiled when required, listened more than she spoke, and noted every shift in Salvatore's posture, every tightening of his jaw. This was not a world designed for mercy. It rewarded perception, punished hesitation. When they finally left, the silence in the car was heavy, unspoken consequences pressing in on all sides. "You shouldn't have brought me," Natalie said quietly. Salvatore's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I know." "Then why did you—" "Because hiding you would have confirmed everything they suspect," he replied. "Visibility can be a shield, and sometimes a target," she said. He didn't argue. The warning came before dawn. Natalie woke to raised voices, the sound of urgent movement beyond the bedroom door. Salvatore stood at the foot of the bed, already dressed, his expression hard. "They hit one of my warehouses," he said. "Minimal loss? Maximum message?" "Because of me," she said. "Because they believe I hesitate now," he corrected. Natalie sat up, the reality settling in. This wasn't symbolic. This wasn't abstract. People would bleed because of decisions made around her existence. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, threatening to steal her breath. "You can still let me go," she said. "If distance protects you," Salvatore turned to her sharply. "I do not owe," he said. "I choose." The words struck with unexpected force. Natalie searched his face, seeing not arrogance but resolve, edged with something like fear. For the first time, she understood the depth of what he risked. Not just power, identity, a lifetime built on unyielding certainty. The next day brought confirmation of what they both knew was coming. A man who had stood beside Salvatore for years was found dead, collateral in a conflict designed to escalate. Natalie felt the loss like a physical ache, grief tangled with responsibility. "This is my world," Salvatore said quietly that night, "and it devours what it touches." Natalie met his gaze, her voice steady despite the storm beneath it. "Then let it devour what you're willing to lose." She said, "Not me. Not because I exist." He studied her for a long moment, something breaking and reforming behind his eyes. "You don't belong here," he said softly. "I know," she replied, "but I'm already in it." Outside, the city moved on, indifferent and vast. Inside the penthouse, two lives balanced on a narrowing edge. Natalie understood now that love, if it came, would not be gentle. It would be forged through consequence and choice, through the refusal to retreat even when the cost became clear. The world she had stepped into was not meant for her, but it was watching her closely, recalculating its assumptions. And somewhere in that recalculation, the first real fracture had begun to form. The night fractured without warning. Natalie woke to the sound of glass exploding somewhere beyond the bedroom, a sharp, violent crash that tore through the penthouse and ripped sleep from her body, before fear could fully form. Salvatore was already moving, pulling her down as another sound followed gunfire, close enough to vibrate through bone. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice low and lethal, already reaching for the weapon hidden beside the bed. Natalie ignored him. She moved on instinct, adrenaline overriding obedience. By the time she reached the living area, chaos had taken shape, security shouting into earpieces, alarms shrieking, wind rushing in through a shattered window. And Salvatore, standing between her and the threat, staggered as a bullet tore through his side. He hit the floor hard. The sound Natalie made wasn't a scream. It was something raw, ripped straight from her chest. She dropped to her knees beside him, hands already pressing against the wound, blood slick and hot beneath her fingers. "Salvatore," she said sharply, "stay with me." His face was pale, jaw clenched against pain, but his eyes found hers with immediate clarity. "You shouldn't be here," he muttered, as if the thought mattered more than the blood soaking his shirt. "Don't talk," she snapped, slipping seamlessly into command. "Focus on breathing." The guards moved to intervene, but she didn't look up. "Clear space," she ordered. "Now, I need towels, a medical kit, and light." No one argued. They turned the study into a makeshift trauma room in minutes. Natalie worked with ruthless efficiency, cutting fabric, cleaning blood, assessing damage. The bullet had passed through muscle, missing vital organs by inches. Close, too close. She felt the truth of it settle into her hands with chilling clarity if the angle had been different. If she had hesitated, he would already be dead. Salvatore drifted, consciousness wavering, but he fought it with stubborn resolve. His hand closed weakly around her wrist. "After this," he said hoarsely, "you leave." Her hands didn't stop moving. "No, this world will kill you," he insisted. "I won't be the reason." Natalie finally looked up, anger flashing through her fear. "You already are," she said, "so stop pretending pushing me away is mercy." The words landed, sharp and undeniable. She finished stabilizing him, securing the wound with practiced care. When it was over, exhaustion crashed into her, leaving her hands trembling. Salvatore lay still, alive, breath shallow but steady. Silence followed, heavy and disorienting. As dawn crept through the broken glass, painting the room in pale light, the reality of what had happened settled over them both. Someone had tried to kill Salvatore in his own home. Not a warning, not a probe, a statement. Natalie sat back on her heels, blood staining her clothes, the weight of it all pressing down hard. She had crossed another line tonight, not as an observer, not as a guest, but as someone who had fought to keep him alive. When Salvatore finally woke fully, it was to the sight of her sitting beside him, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, but unyielding. "This ends," he said quietly. Natalie's heart tightened. "What does you?" he replied. "In danger because of me." She stood abruptly. "You don't get to decide that." "I nearly died," he said, "because I hesitated. And I saved you," she shot back, "because I didn't." The tension snapped tight between them, fear and fury tangling until neither could tell where one ended and the other began. Natalie drew a steadying breath, forcing herself to speak the truth she had been circling since the first drop of blood left her body. "I won't be hidden," she said, "and I won't be discarded when things get dangerous. If I stay, it's because I choose to, not because you cage me for my own good." Salvatore stared at her, something raw flickering beneath his control. "You don't understand the cost," he said. "I do," she replied quietly. "I felt it under my hands tonight." The admission shifted something fundamental. For the first time, Salvatore looked uncertain, not weak, but altered, as if the rules he had lived by no longer fit the reality standing in front of him. "They will come again," he said finally. "Harder, smarter. They will use you if they can." "Then we don't let them," Natalie said. "No lies, no half-truths, no decisions made without me." A long silence followed. Salvatore turned his gaze toward the rising sun, jaw tight, the weight of decades of instinct warring with something new and dangerous restraint. "You are asking me to unlearn everything," he said. "I'm asking you to trust me," she replied. He looked at her then, really looked at her not as leverage, not as a vulnerability, but as an equal standing in the aftermath of violence and choice. Slowly, deliberately, he nodded. "Agreed," he said. The word carried more weight than any vow. Outside, the city woke, unaware of the shift that had occurred overnight. Lines had been crossed, boundaries redrawn. The man who did not owe had bled, and the woman who had once been invisible had refused to step aside. After the sound of that bullet, there was no returning to who they had been before, only forward, into consequence. The days following the shooting unfolded in a silence so deliberate it felt rehearsed. Repairs were made to the penthouse with quiet efficiency. Glass replaced. Security doubled. Orders issued in voices too calm for the violence they implied. From the outside, nothing appeared broken. From the inside, everything had shifted. Salvatore recovered quickly, physically at least. Natalie watched the wound heal beneath her hands, watched his strength return in measured increments. What did not return was the ease with which he had once moved through his world. He listened more, spoke less. And when he spoke, it was with a restraint that had not existed before the bullet demanded a reckoning. Natalie remained. Not as a concession, not as a shield, as a presence that refused to be reduced. They began to talk differently, not about feelings neither of them trusted those words yet, but about consequences, about visibility, about what could be surrendered without collapse. Salvatore laid his world open to her in fragments maps without labels, names spoken once and never repeated, alliances that required performance more than loyalty. Natalie listened, asked questions that cut to the structure beneath the spectacle. "You don't need all of this," she said one evening, gesturing toward the city that glowed beneath them. "You need less." Salvatore regarded her carefully. "Less is more dangerous," he replied. "It invites miscalculation. Or it corrects it," she said. He didn't answer, but he thought about it. The call came 3 nights later. Natalie heard the shift in his voice before she heard the words. Salvatore ended the call and stood very still. The city reflected in the glass behind him like a fractured map. "They took a dock," he said. "One of my oldest routes." "Was anyone hurt?" Natalie asked. "Yes." The answer sat between them, heavy and unresolved. Natalie felt the familiar pull of responsibility, the instinct to shoulder blame that did not fully belong to her. She pushed it away. This was not about guilt. It was about structure. "They're testing you," she said, "to see if you'll respond the way you always have." Salvatore's jaw tightened. "And if I don't, they'll escalate." He turned to her then, eyes sharp. "You understand this world better than you should." Natalie met his gaze without flinching. "I understand pressure," she said, "and I understand what happens when it's misdirected." That night, Salvatore made the first move no one expected. He withdrew support from a volatile alliance that had defined his reach for years. The decision rippled outward immediately, unsettling markets, shifting loyalties. It was not mercy, it was strategy, a signal that the rules were changing. The response was swift. A message arrived the next morning, delivered without threat or apology. A single line, typed and unadorned. "You are bleeding control." Salvatore read it once, then deleted it. Natalie watched his face, saw something like relief flicker briefly beneath the tension. "Does that scare you?" she asked. "No," he said. "It clarifies." The second move cost more. Salvatore shut down a revenue stream that had been untouchable for a decade. The loss was not just financial. It stripped him of a leverage that had kept certain rivals cautious. The reaction was immediate and brutal. A man who had stood beside Salvatore since his youth was found dead, the message unmistakable. Natalie absorbed the news in silence, grief tightening her chest. "I'm sorry," she said finally. Salvatore shook his head. "This is not on you." "It's not," she replied quietly. He looked at her then, really looked, seeing not accusation but honesty. "This is the cost of my world," he said, Not of your presence. And if the cost becomes me, she asked. He didn't hesitate. Then I stop paying in blood. The certainty in his voice unsettled her more than doubt would have. Natalie understood then that the choice was no longer theoretical. It was underway, irreversible. Salvatore was dismantling something that had defined him long before she existed. The warning came that evening. Natalie was alone in the living space when the elevator chimed unexpectedly. Security reacted instantly, but the man who stepped out did not resist. Martinelli smiled as though he had been invited. "Relax," he said lightly. "Hands visible. I only want to speak." Salvatore arrived seconds later, fury coiled tight beneath his calm. "You're trespassing. I'm observing," Martinelli replied, his gaze sliding to Natalie. "You've changed the board. I wanted to see what inspired the creativity." Natalie stepped forward before Salvatore could stop her. "Say what you came to say." Martinelli's smile sharpened. "You think choice makes you free," he said to her. "It doesn't. It makes you expensive." Salvatore's voice cut through the room. "Leave." Martinelli inclined his head. "Soon," he said, "one way or another." When the elevator doors closed behind him, the silence was absolute. "That was a line," Natalie said. "Yes," Salvatore agreed. "And he crossed it because I allowed him to believe I wouldn't respond." Natalie turned to face him fully. "Then respond," she said, "but not the way they expect." He searched her face, seeing resolve where fear might have lived. "If I do this," he said, "there is no shelter, no return." "I know," she replied. "That's why it has to be your decision, not mine." Salvatore exhaled slowly, the weight of decades settling into a single moment. "I built an empire to survive," he said. "Not to live." Natalie reached for his hand, steady and certain. "Then, choose living." He closed his fingers around hers, the gesture unguarded. In that contact, something final took shape. The choice, once made, left no shelter, only direction. The truth arrived quietly, without drama or warning, as truths often did when they had waited long enough to be undeniable. Natalie sensed it before she confirmed it. Her body moved differently now, its rhythms subtly altered, its signals too precise for her training to ignore. Fatigue lingered in ways sleep did not cure. Certain smells turned sharp and unbearable. Her emotions, usually disciplined, carefully contained, slipped their boundaries without permission. She told herself it was stress, the aftermath of gunfire, the weight of proximity to a world that never slept. She was lying to herself. The test sat on the bathroom counter for a long time before she picked it up. Natalie stared at it with clinical detachment, as though the answer belonged to someone else. When the result appeared, unmistakable and final, the air seemed to thin around her. Pregnant. The word landed not as fear, but as gravity. Heavy, inescapable. She sank onto the edge of the tub, one hand resting instinctively against her abdomen, as if the body already knew what the mind was still absorbing. A life was forming, quietly and insistently, inside a world that devoured weakness without apology. She did not cry. She breathed, slowly, deliberately, the way she had taught countless patients to do in moments of crisis. Salvatore had to know. But knowing how he would respond did not make saying it easier. She waited until evening, until the city outside softened into gold and shadow. Salvatore stood near the window when she approached him, his posture taut with the vigilance that had become second nature. He turned at the sound of her footsteps, reading something in her face immediately. "What is it?" he asked. Natalie didn't sit. She didn't look away. "I'm pregnant." For a moment, the world paused. Salvatore didn't speak. His expression did not change, but something deep beneath it fractured. His hand tightened at his side, as if restraining an instinct older than reason. When he finally exhaled, it was slow and controlled. "Are you sure?" "Yes." The word echoed between them. "Absolute." "This changes everything," he said quietly. "It doesn't have to change who we are," Natalie replied. "Only what we're willing to protect." Salvatore turned away, pacing once across the room before stopping. "You don't understand what a child means in my world," he said. "Bloodlines are claims, invitations, targets." Natalie stepped closer, her voice steady. "Then this child will not belong to your world," she said. "It will belong to us." He looked at her sharply. "You think they'll respect that I think we stop asking what they respect," she said, "and start deciding what we refuse." Before he could respond, Antonio appeared in the doorway, tension etched into every line of his body. "We have a problem," he said. "Martinelli is asking questions."
Quietly. About you. The room tightened instantly. Salvatore's jaw clenched, fury flickering beneath restraint. How much does he know enough to suspect? Antonio replied. Not enough to prove. Natalie felt the shift immediately. Suspicion was more dangerous than certainty. It invited experimentation. That night, Salvatore slept lightly, one arm draped protectively across Natalie's waist, as though proximity itself were a barrier. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the enormity of the situation pressing down on her. This was no longer just about survival. It was about inheritance, about what would be passed down, not just blood, but consequence. The message arrived at dawn, a single envelope, delivered by hand, placed on the table without a word. Inside, one line written in precise, elegant script. Blood calls to blood. Congratulations. Natalie read it twice, then handed it to Salvatore. The fury in his eyes was cold and immediate. They believe this gives them standing, he said. A claim. They're wrong, Natalie replied. Salvatore looked at her then. Really looked, seeing not vulnerability, but resolve. If this becomes public, he said, there will be no perimeter strong enough. Then we don't defend a perimeter, she said. We change the battlefield. The days that followed were marked by calculated withdrawal. Salvatore began severing ties with volatile factions, dismantling structures that thrived on visibility and bloodshed. Each decision was a quiet declaration, a refusal to play by rules that no longer served what mattered most. The backlash was immediate. A car followed Natalie one afternoon, shadowing her through familiar streets. It never approached, never threatened. It didn't need to. The message was clear she was seen. Security intercepted it before it could escalate. But the incident lingered like a bruise. That evening, Natalie stood beside Salvatore, her hand resting over her stomach. We can't outmaneuver them forever, she said. Eventually, they'll force an ending. Yes, he agreed. So we choose it. The words settled between them, heavy and final. Salvatore understood now that the empire he had built was no longer a shield. It was bait. Every symbol of power invited challenge. Every alliance demanded proof of dominance. A child changed the equation entirely. We will disappear, he said. Not run, reposition. We erase the expectations before they harden. Natalie nodded. And the cost, Salvatore met her gaze without flinching. Everything that made my name valuable. For the first time, Natalie saw the full weight of what he was offering, not escape, but transformation. A dismantling of identity so complete it bordered on annihilation. She reached for his hand. Then we do it together, she said. No more borrowed time. Outside. The city pulsed on, unaware that its calculations were already obsolete. Somewhere in its depths, men sharpened knives and rehearsed futures that would never come to pass. Inside the penthouse, a different future took shape, fragile, defiant, and worth the destruction of an empire. The truth had been spoken. There would be no hiding it now. The dismantling did not begin with violence. It began with absence. Salvatore stopped answering calls that once would have commanded his immediate attention. Meetings were postponed, then quietly canceled, shipments rerouted, accounts frozen, not in panic, but with deliberate precision. To the outside world, it looked like hesitation. To those who truly understood his methods, it was something far more dangerous intention. Natalie watched it unfold from the inside, aware of the magnitude even when the signs were subtle. A name removed from a contact list, a document burned rather than filed, a map folded and put away, as if geography itself were no longer relevant. Each decision stripped another layer from the man Salvatore had been, leaving behind something leaner, sharper, and strangely freer. But the world he was leaving did not release its hold without protest. The first real strike came at dusk, when the city was caught between light and shadow. Natalie sensed it before the call arrived, a tightening in the air that made her chest ache. Salvatore's phone rang once. He listened in silence, his expression hardening with every word he did not speak. They took a warehouse, he said when the call ended. Burned it. Empty, but symbolic. Martinelli, Natalie said. Yes. She didn't ask if anyone had been hurt. In this world, that question rarely had a clean answer. Salvatore turned toward her, his gaze steady but unguarded. They're accelerating, he said. They believe pressure will force me back into alignment. And will it? Natalie asked. He shook his head. It confirms the decision. That night, Salvatore made moves that could not be reversed. He handed over entire routes to rivals who would tear each other apart over them. He leaked information carefully.
just enough to collapse fragile alliances from within. He redirected blame, set traps not to win, but to destabilize. By morning, the Underworld was no longer watching him. It was watching itself. The cost arrived swiftly. A man Salvatore had trusted since his earliest days did not survive the fallout. The news came quietly, without spectacle. Natalie saw the moment it landed. The way Salvatore's shoulders tightened, the way his breath stilled. He did not rage. He did not break. He absorbed it, letting the weight settle where it would remain forever. "I'm sorry," Natalie said softly. Salvatore nodded once. "This is the price of ending things cleanly." "But it doesn't feel clean," she replied. "No," he agreed. It feels final." The attempt came 2 days later. They were leaving the building in a reduced convoy, the city sliding past in tense, watchful silence, when the car lurched violently. Tires screamed. Glass shattered. Natalie was thrown forward, instinctively reaching for her abdomen as Salvatore pulled her down against the seat, his body shielding hers. Gunfire erupted, sharp and deafening in the confined space. It was over almost as quickly as it began. Salvatore's men responded with ruthless efficiency, forcing the attackers to retreat before they could close in. When the car finally sped away, the silence that followed was thick and disorienting. Natalie's hands trembled as she checked herself. Then him. Blood stained his sleeve. But the wound was shallow, a grazing hit meant to warn rather than kill. "They're running out of time," Salvatore said quietly. "And so are we," Natalie replied. That night, Salvatore stood alone by the window long after Natalie had gone to bed. The city reflected back at him, fractured and distant. For the first time, he allowed himself to see the Empire not as a shield, but as an anchor, one that would drag everything he loved into the depths if he didn't cut it loose completely. He joined Natalie in the bedroom just before dawn. She woke as he sat on the edge of the bed, sensing the shift immediately. "You've decided," she said. "Yes." She waited. "I will finish it," he said. "All of it." "No half measures?" Natalie reached for his hand, her grip steady. "And what will that leave you?" Salvatore exhaled slowly. "A man without a crown," he said, "and a chance." The final collapse came faster than anyone expected. Salvatore triggered the chain reaction he had been carefully assembling, exposing corruption, igniting old rivalries, and removing himself as a central figure. The power vacuum swallowed itself whole. By the time the dust settled, there was nothing left to reclaim. Martinelli did not survive the week. The news arrived through back channels, distorted but unmistakable. Natalie saw no satisfaction in Salvatore's reaction, only closure, the kind that came too late to undo the damage, but early enough to prevent more. They left before sunrise. No announcements, no goodbyes, just two people stepping out of a city that no longer recognized them. The plane carried them across the ocean, away from the geography of violence and towards something quieter, uncertain, and real. Italy greeted them with salt air and open sky. A remote coastal estate became their refuge, the sea stretching endlessly before them. For the first time since the hospital night, Natalie slept without listening for footsteps. Salvatore changed in ways that surprised even himself, without the constant vigilance of command. He softened at the edges. The steel remained, but it was no longer his only shape. He walked the cliffs each morning, hand resting protectively over Natalie's growing belly, as if grounding himself in the life taking form beneath his palm. One evening, as the sun bled into the sea, Natalie leaned against him and spoke the truth they had both been holding. "We survived," she said, "but nothing we were survives with us." Salvatore kissed her hair gently. "Good," he replied. "Then we can finally begin." The war was not over, but the ending had already started. The sea taught them how to breathe again. In the weeks after their arrival, time softened into something unfamiliar. Mornings arrived without alarms. Nights passed without calculation. The coastal estate existed outside the maps that had once defined Salvatore's power, perched above water that changed color with the light, indifferent to the ghosts he had left behind. Natalie learned the rhythm of the place slowly, letting the sound of waves replace the echo of sirens in her memory. Salvatore changed most in silence. He rose early, walking the cliffs as if mapping a territory that no longer needed defending. The habits of command remained watchfulness, precision, but they no longer consumed him. He learned to stand still, to let hours pass without filling them with consequence. When Natalie joined him, his hand found hers without thought, the contact grounding and unguarded. Their intimacy deepened not through urgency, but through presence. Conversations stretched longer, wandering into places they had never had the luxury to explore. Natalie spoke of the childhood she barely remembered,
of a mother whose absence had shaped her more than any memory. Salvatore spoke of Sicily, of a father whose lessons had been delivered in discipline rather than affection, of a boy who learned early that survival demanded sharp edges. "You don't have to be sharp here," Natalie said once, resting her head against his shoulder. Salvatore didn't answer. He didn't need to. The way his arm tightened around her said enough. The pregnancy progressed without complication, each milestone quietly miraculous. Natalie felt the child move for the first time on a warm afternoon. Sunlight spilling across the terrace. She gasped, hand flying to her belly. Salvatore froze, then knelt slowly, reverently, pressing his palm where she guided him. The movement was small, almost imperceptible, and yet it undid him. For a long moment, he couldn't speak, couldn't. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, unguarded in a way Natalie had never seen. "I didn't know it could feel like this," he said softly. She smiled through her own tears. Neither did I. The threat they had escaped did not vanish entirely. Occasionally, a name surfaced through distant channels, a rumor of inquiry that went nowhere, but the world they had dismantled had devoured itself efficiently. Without Salvatore at its center, it lacked coherence, power scattered, intent dissolved, distance, it turned out, was not just geographic. The night Natalie went into labor arrived without drama, as if even her body understood that violence no longer belonged here. The pain built steadily, purposefully, and Salvatore stayed with her through every moment, anchoring her when waves of sensation threatened to overwhelm. When the child finally arrived, the room filled with a sound that had never existed in their lives before new, fierce and undeniable. Natalie cried freely then, exhaustion and joy tangling until she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. Salvatore held their child with reverent care, as if the smallest movement might shatter something sacred. He laughed softly, a sound so rare it startled him. "She's perfect," Natalie whispered. Salvatore nodded, unable to speak. They named her without ceremony, choosing something simple and strong, unburdened by legacy, a name that belonged to the future rather than the past. In the days that followed, the estate filled with a quiet warmth. Salvatore learned the rituals of care with focused dedication, treating each task with the seriousness he had once reserved for strategy. Natalie watched him with a mixture of tenderness and awe, understanding that this was the truest transformation he could have chosen. One evening, as the sky burned gold and rose above the sea, Salvatore led Natalie to the edge of the cliff where they had first stood together. He took her hands, his expression open, unarmored. "I don't have an empire to offer you," he said. "No name that commands, no promises backed by fear." Natalie smiled gently. "I never wanted those. I can offer you a life built on choice." He continued. "On staying, even when leaving would be easier." She stepped closer, resting her forehead against his. "Then stay," she said. "With us." He kissed her then, slow and certain, the kind of kiss that didn't claim or conquer, but affirmed. Years later, the story would still live quietly inside them, the hospital lights, the needle. The moment blood crossed a boundary neither of them had known existed. Natalie would sometimes think of that night and marvel at how something so small had altered the trajectory of everything. Blood had called to blood, but it had not bound them to darkness. It had led them here to a life chosen freely, built carefully, and protected not by violence, but by devotion.